Wake Forest believes that providing access to world-class speakers is part of a student's global education as well as a commitment to the community in which we live. Tonight's discussion is about nuclear weapons and the fragility of the nuclear order. Whether you remember the Cold War or as a student just learning about it, nuclear security has occupied a large part of our political and social landscape for decades. And tonight, this is a very timely topic. Just in the last few days, we have learned that Iran is developing an underground uranium enrichment facility and is test-firing long-range missiles. We are pleased tonight to have with us Dr. Graham Allison, an international expert in the field of nuclear security and prominent as anyone in the study of modern government. Dr. Allison is director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Policy and is Douglas Dillon Professor of Government at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Dr. Allison was the founding dean of the modern Kennedy School, and under his leadership from 1977 to 1989, a small, undefined program grew 20-fold to become the leading professional school of public policy and government. Dr. Allison is also a renowned scholar. His seminal book, Essence of Decision, explaining the Cuban Missile Crisis, was first published in 1971. It's been extensively republished. It ranks among the bestsellers of 20th century political science with more than 400,000 copies in print. His latest work, Nuclear Terrorism, the Ultimate Preventable Catastrophe, is now in its third printing and was selected by the New York Times as one of the most notable books of 2004. Dr. Allison has also extensive experience in government. He's advised every president since Ronald Reagan. He served as a member of the Defense Policy Board for Secretaries Weinberger, Carlucci, Cheney, Aspen, Perry, and Cohen. Just this afternoon, in fact, he comes from Washington where he tells me he was visiting with General Petraeus. He has the sole distinction of having twice been awarded the Distinguished Public Service Medal, the highest civilian award for the Department of Defense. I'm particularly pleased to welcome Graham Allison back to his home state. He is a native North Carolinian, born and raised in Charlotte, and actually before going to Harvard, he spent 2 years at Davidson College. It's also a personal pleasure for me to have Graham here tonight. His father, Graham, and my mother, Mitty, were first cousins and grew up together in Charlotte. And I remember Graham's exploit as a football player from Myers Park High School. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Graham Allison.
Thank you very much, President Hatch, for such a generous introduction. And let me say to students and others gathered here tonight, what an honor and a pleasure it is for me to have a chance to be here tonight. When people ask me, where do I come from, it takes about a microsecond to say North Carolina. I'm very proud to be a North Carolinian. I was lucky to grow up in Charlotte, North Carolina, to go to Davidson. My brother graduated from Davidson. I keep track of Wake Forest, I would say, and I try to keep track of North Carolina, so it's a real pleasure for me to be back home in this respect. As President Hatch said, I did just come from Washington today, and the agenda of things we're going to talk about tonight include, and when we get to the questions and answers, I'm happy to go virtually in any direction people would like to go, include Iran, where I was at a meeting today of policy folks trying to understand what's going to happen as a consequence of which just was today, the first negotiation face-to-face between Americans and Iranians in 30 years. So that meeting occurred this morning in Geneva. And this afternoon, the question was Afghanistan, where General Petraeus has been going through a marathon set of debates that President Obama is conducting right now about what will be probably the most fateful foreign policy decision of his administration, namely whether to make Afghanistan essentially Obama's war. And if that weren't enough, if you try to think about Afghanistan, what's really interesting about Afghanistan is that it actually is part of a single problem called either AFPAC, that is Afghanistan and Pakistan, look at your geography, or what I call it, PACAF, because I think actually Afghanistan is just the tail on the dog of the larger problem, which is Pakistan. So all these issues come together, and they're the basis for then trying to talk tonight about a deadly serious issue, maybe even a scary issue, namely nuclear terrorism, like one nuclear bomb exploding in one city, and the broader issue of nuclear proliferation, and all that in the context of the global nuclear order. And but to jump quickly to my bottom line, in case anybody gets discouraged before I get there in 30 minutes from now, the bottom line is positive. I'm not pessimistic. The subtitle of my nuclear terrorism book, which is the most important punchline, says the ultimate preventable catastrophe, with an underline of preventable. That is, I believe there's a feasible, affordable agenda of actions that, if taken, would reduce the likelihood of this to nearly zero. So that's where I'm going to, but I'm going to get there in a little bit of a circuitous route. So you may flag a little bit as we're going. So what I'm going to do is take about 30 minutes. There's 4 sections to this. First is a quiz. No Harvard presentation is complete without a quiz. It was handed out. I'm going to give you 45 seconds to do it just in a second when I finish telling you what the 4 points are. Secondly is a 6.5-minute video docudrama, which was made by the Nuclear Threat Initiative, an organization co-chaired by Sam Nunn and Ted Turner, and which I helped with, and which provides a vivid video version of the question, or answers to the question, how could terrorists get a nuclear bomb? How could they bring it into an American city? And what the conversation would be like at the White House while this was happening, or if this was discovered to be happening. Thirdly, I'm going to take you through a forced march, very fast, of the core of the argument of my nuclear terrorism book published in 2004 that President Hatch referred to. And then fourth and finally, we'll be open for questions. And I would encourage you to think of whatever questions, but including points of disagreement. So it's not required to agree. So that's the plan. So for the quiz, if you've got it there in front of you, and I would say just, this is only a way, it's not graded. We're going to, by the time we get through the 30 minutes, you should know the answers to these, or at least my answers. But the first question is, could the global nuclear order today be as fragile as the global financial order was 2 years ago, when people were all reassuring us that it was sound, stable, and resilient? So the answer to that is yes or no, okay? So you choose. Secondly, could North Korea's Kim Jong-il imagine that he could sell a nuclear bomb to Osama bin Laden and get away with it? So just to remind you, Kim Jong-il has 10 bombs worth of plutonium today. He's conducted 2 tests. Could he sell 1 bomb to Osama bin Laden? Could he think he could do that and get away with it? Thirdly, to Iran and the issue for today, imagine that Iran's nuclear enrichment facility at Natanz, that's their declared facility that's regularly inspected, and this facility at Qom, which was just revealed last week, as President Hatch said, were eliminated, erased, either by a negotiated agreement or by an Israeli airstrike, so destroyed. What impact would that have on the date in which Iran acquires its first nuclear weapon? And this is a multiple choice, so delay, advance, or none. We'll come back to these in the end, but you'll get a chance to offer your view. I'll see where the audience is, and I'll give you my view. So that's the end of part one, the quiz. Part two, this docudrama is called Last Best Chance. I mentioned to you that it was created by the Nuclear Threat Initiative. It's fictional, but it's based on a fact line in which every item in the fictional story is factually plausible from experts who know what's actually going on. And when this was being cast back in 2006, the question was for the docudrama, who should be chosen to play president in the conversation that's going on at the time? And we chose Fred Thompson, whom you may, some of you will remember he's the judge in Law and Order, who also was a senator from Tennessee, and who became so enamored of this issue that he actually ran for the nomination in 2008. Not successfully, but so why don't we show the docudrama?
А как они вам, мой друг, платят за вашу важную работу?
Часто опаздывают. И всегда на них хватает. Нам квартира побольше нужна.
В советские времена была такая присказка. Мы делаем вид, что работаем, а они, что нам платят. Павел, в этом конверте ваша зарплата за 5 лет. Авиабилеты в Венгрию. Она же венгерка, ваша жена, да?
Да.
Венгерские паспорта на новые имена. А визы мы можем достать в любую страну мира, куда вы только с семьей захотите уехать.
За 2 боеголовки.
Только 2.
Только 2. Не видишь уже, как прямо через проходную?
Ну как? Мы дадим вам почти настоящие документы, чтобы вывести боеголовки на профилактику. Пожалуйста. Павел с одним нашим знакомым приедет на военном грузовике, чтобы отвезти их на профилактику. Все будет как обычно.
Потом ваши клиенты их используют. Погибнут тысячи людей.
Если не у нас, они достанут их где-нибудь еще.
Both Canadian citizens?
We are.
I know that we're a target, but you could be as well. And we both know that if a bomb goes off, regardless of the source, our military forces will go to DEFCON 2.
We'd have the same response.
No criticism intended, but your early warning system is eroded and could mistakenly think they're seeing an American missile headed toward Russia. One false move could be catastrophic. That might be part of the terrorist plan.
You and I must be in immediate contact at all times. We don't want our nuclear command system, or yours, launching missiles at each other.
Thank you, Dmitri. Let's keep an open line. Now, Bernie, can you and this group of wizards here explain to me just how the hell we got here?
Sir, Al-Qaeda has computed all the Muslims killed in the past 50 years. Bosnia, Afghanistan, Somalia, the whole Middle East. Their spokesman has publicly announced that they believe they're owed 4 million lives.
Well, they posted it on their website.
Nukes would be the fastest way to vengeance. The only way to stop them from exploding a nuclear bomb is to keep the components out of their hands. No nuclear materials, no nuclear weapons, no nuclear terrorism.
If they have a warhead, we probably can't find it.
Or if they have plutonium or highly enriched uranium, they could find someone who can make them a bomb.
We've been finding bomb diagrams in Al-Qaeda camps ever since Afghanistan.
The U.S., Russia, and every other member of the G8 pledged $20 billion to help secure the weapons, the HEU, and the plutonium.
Then why can't we keep Al-Qaeda from going nuclear?
Well, I said pledge, sir. Reality is, we've not collected much cash or made much progress yet.
How much of this stuff is in Russia, Nick?
Enough to make 60 to 80,000 bombs, sir.
How much is secure?
Less than half. There's still at least 300 metric tons at risk.
And how long until you're done?
Our goal is to get it done in 4 years.
At the present rate, it'll take at least 13 years.
Come on, Nick. That rate will all be dead before you finish.
It's complicated, sir. For example, both we and the Russians agreed that they needed fencing and nuclear sensors, which they can't afford. So we bought them. But then they can't pay to install them.
Well, we can.
We tried, but our lawyers say we need to be on every site to inspect the work to make sure it's done right.
And the Russians think we just want to spy. I mean, I heard that from Dmitri an hour ago.
We fight over travel visas, contracting rules, who pays if a worker gets hurt, who's liable in case of an accident.
Well, everyone here is going to be liable if an American city blows up. Nuclear terrorism is the most dangerous threat facing the world, and we're fighting over accounting rules and tax bills.
The terrorists are racing, and we're crawling.
All right, who in this group is responsible for nuclear terrorism? And who's in charge? Well, I guess old Harry Truman was right.
It answered three questions. One, how could terrorists get a nuclear bomb? Buy it out of the arsenal of some state with the middleman a crook. Secondly, if terrorists got a nuclear bomb, how could they bring it to an American city? The answer is all the ways that people come and bring things to American cities today. For example, in this instance, this was disguised in a wrapper as material that was going to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and the state of the detection mechanisms that we currently have at the border wouldn't discover a appropriately shielded, highly enriched uranium bomb. And thirdly, if this were happening, what would the conversation be like? I think it would be extremely like the conversation you just heard. So quite realistic. Yeah. Many of you won't remember way back 5 years ago, in 2004, there was a presidential televised debate. Two candidates were President Bush and the challenger, Senator Kerry. Question was asked, what's the single most serious threat to the United States? Senator Kerry was asked to answer first. He said nuclear terrorism. President Bush answered second. He said, I agree with my opponent that the single most serious threat to the country is nuclear weapons in the hands of a terrorist network. I underline that I agree with my opponent because that was the only time in a hotly contested campaign when either candidate used those 5 words in that sequence. President Obama in the campaign and more recently has said the following, and each of them deserves to be read. Nuclear terrorism is a threat above all others. The single most important national security threat we face is nuclear weapons falling into the hands of terrorists. The most urgent threat to the security of the U.S. and the world is the spread of nuclear weapons and materials and technology and the risk that a nuclear device will fall into the hands of terrorists, bringing us, in effect, a nuclear 9/11. This is not just an American assessment. In 2005, the Secretary General of the UN impaneled 12 wise men and women from worldwide. The American participant was Brent Scowcroft, who had been the National Security Advisor for President Bush 41. And this panel found nuclear danger was the top of the pyramid of the 6 dangers that they identified for the 25 years ahead. But they said about it that and this is relevant to the first question in your quiz, we're approaching a point at which the erosion of the non-proliferation regime, the order, could become irreversible and result in a cascade of proliferation. Think North Korea and Iran. This is a good way to try to get your bearings when trying to think about something this mind-stretching, is to ask, what are the best judgments of the people who've had to shoulder responsibility for this issue? So George Tenet, who had been director of CIA for President Bush, says he's convinced that this is where Osama bin Laden and his operatives most desperately want to go. There's no question they've been searching for bombs, looking for bombs, paying for what they hoped would be bombs. Bob Gates, the Secretary of Defense under both President Bush and now President Obama, says everybody is asked from time to time, what is it that keeps you up at night? The thought of terrorists ending up with the weapons of mass destruction, especially nuclear. And Mike McConnell, who was the Director of National Intelligence and had earlier been the head of the National Security Agency, whom I also saw today, and we were chatting about this. He says, the more I know, the more I worry about the threat of nuclear terrorism. So what would nuclear terrorism look like? This bomb chart comes out of the nuclear terrorism book that was mentioned. It imagines that the Dragonfire bomb, which was a small 10-kiloton explosion bomb that the U.S. thought was in New York City a month after 9/11, was driven into Times Square, exploded on a workday. If you look, everything in the red zone that goes out about 1/3 of a mile from ground zero disappears instantaneously, vaporized in a huge release of energy that reaches about 540,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So it just disappears. And everything out to the blue zone, which is more than a mile, looks like the federal office building in Oklahoma City after a homegrown American terrorist bombed it, if you remember, back in 1995, killing 162 children and women and men. If that seems too far away, I did Wake Forest. There's a website here, you can see nuclearterrorism.org, that was put up in conjunction with the book. You can put in your zip code and see what Dragonfire's bomb would do in the neighborhood. President Hatch would not have to be working hard raising money to expand the campus. That would be for sure. Okay, most people, when they think of nuclear weapons, think of a large warhead sitting on top of a missile. That's what most nuclear weapons are like, but this is a suitcase nuclear bomb. An American nuclear bomb from the Cold War, that's the whole thing. Excuse me, it's called a special atomic demolition munition. Its purpose was for special forces to take it behind the lines of the enemy and blow up things like airports or even political leadership groups. To see how small a nuclear weapon can be, this is actually a nuclear weapon. This fits in an artillery shell. This was a tactical nuclear weapon in the American arsenal. Again, the Soviets had the same thing. Thousands of these were made. How many of them are fully accounted for? Okay, let me take you to the argument of the book again, once over lightly. This book here, Nuclear Terrorism, referred to, has two parts. Excuse me, part one and part two. Part one says inevitable. Part two says preventable. The juxtaposition of the two require explanation. So part one says inevitable. Part two says preventable by a feasible, affordable agenda of actions that if we took, would reduce the likelihood of this to nearly zero. So to expand on the first proposition, if the US and all other governments just keep doing what we're doing today, my best judgment is that a nuclear terrorist attack, a successful nuclear terrorist attack, is more likely than not in the decade ahead, that is before summer of 2014. That's just my best judgment. The Commission on Preventing WMD Terrorism and Proliferation, which reported in December of last year, December of 2008, said its judgment was that a nuclear or biological attack somewhere in the world by terrorists was more likely than not by the end of 2013. So that's just in the same range. That is, if everybody just stays on autopilot, just on the current trend line. Warren Buffett is not only the world's most successful investor, but is somebody who thinks a lot about odds. He's in the business of reinsurance. So they buy insurance from insurance companies. He's become interested in this issue. He says, I don't see any way that it won't happen. And then he offers this very nice mathematical calculation, which is if the chance of a nuclear bomb going off in a given year is 10%, and if you continue in that same trajectory with 10% a year for 50 years, the probability of the event happening is 99.6, or almost certain. So that's just mathematical identity. How do I get to the judgment? Okay, I end up for organizing my chapter, my part one of the book, in 5 chapters, basically using the journalist techniques. Who, what, where, when, how. So who could be planning a nuclear attack? Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden says it's their religious duty. As you saw in the docudrama, they've announced their intention to kill 4 million Americans. You're not going to get there by hijacking airplanes and crashing them into buildings at 3,000 a clip. What could they use? A nuclear weapon that's been made by some state, or a crude nuclear weapon called an improvised nuclear device made out of material, fissile material that was made by a state. Where could terrorists acquire a bomb? Well, from states that have made the bomb or from countries that have made material from which you could make a bomb. When could terrorists launch their first attack? Well, when they get a bomb. So if Dragonfire, this source, who was the source of the report that I mentioned, that I describe in the introduction to this nuclear terrorism book, that led President Bush to think there might be a nuclear bomb in New York in October of 2001, had been right, and there had been a bomb there, it would have already exploded. So when they get a bomb, they'll use it. How would they get it to the target? Think about all the ways that illegal items come to our cities today. Those are precisely the same paths that terrorists would use for a bomb. So how do drugs get to cities? How do illegal immigrants get to cities? How does illegal material get to cities? We have very large and very porous borders. So part one, which is somewhat depressing, but make sure what the proposition is, on the current trajectory, if we just keep doing what we're doing, we and everybody else, I believe the likelihood is that we'll see such a horrible event. Now to part two, the better news, preventable. Part two says there exists a feasible, affordable agenda of actions that if we took would reduce the likelihood of this to nearly zero. Some of them we're not taking at all. some we're not taking fast enough. Again, to go back to Warren Buffett, and he's doing the calculations, he says, imagine that we took a bunch of actions and reduced what had been the likelihood of a nuclear terrorist attack from 10% to 1%. So now it's only 1% a year. Roll that out for 50 years, and there's a 60% chance that it doesn't happen. Now, there's nothing magic about 1%. Why don't we reduce it to 1/10 of 1%? In which case, there's hundreds of years without this happening. So this is not, we're in the grips of forces beyond our control. This is a question, do we do what we know how to do, that we can afford to do, that's feasible to do? So how to do? Big, long, complicated subject. Obviously, in trying to think of preventing nuclear terrorism, one's got to have a multi-layered account, multi-layered defense, and one's got to be all azimuth, 360 degrees. But fortunately, in the case of nuclear terrorism, which is different, let's say, from bioterrorism, on the supply side, there's a strategic narrow or choke point that if we choke tightly enough, would reduce the likelihood to nearly zero. And I propose to address that under what I've argued for as a doctrine of 3 no's. No loose nukes, so no weapons loose enough that in the docudrama the fellow, Pavel could have, or the other fellow could have stolen them. So locked up as good as gold. Secondly, no new nascent nukes, no new national enrichment of uranium or reprocessing of plutonium. Enriching uranium is what Iran is doing tonight. Reprocessing plutonium is what North Korea is doing tonight. And third, no new nuclear weapon states. Let me say another word about these. No loose nukes means securing all weapons, all materials, everywhere, as good as gold. I gave this presentation in Russia, in the Kremlin, back in 2006, and I asked the question, with all the confusion that accompanied the collapse of the Soviet Union and all the corruption, how many of the treasures from the Kremlin armory, where they keep their icons and other things that are valuable parts of Russian history, went missing? The answer is 0. If you ask how much gold has been stolen from Fort Knox, answer, none, not 1 ounce. So human beings know how to lock up things we don't want people to steal. It's hard work, but we know how to do it. Secondly, no new nascent nukes. This means no new national enrichment of uranium or reprocessing of plutonium. And that brings us head on to Iran and North Korea. And thirdly, no new nuclear weapon states. North Korea is in this odd man position in which it is the only self-declared but unrecognized nuclear weapon state. De facto, North Korea has 10 bombs worth of plutonium and has conducted 2 tests. But we and all the other parties say, we're not accepting this, we're not recognizing it, we intend to roll it back, and North Korea has repeatedly agreed to eliminate their weapons. Of course, they just don't do it. In the North Korean case, I would say we should continue fighting the fight to prevent North Korea becoming a nuclear weapon state, and especially becoming a recognized nuclear weapon state, and ultimately eliminating North Korean weapons, though that's a huge challenge at this point, and maybe an insurmountable challenge. So, how have we been doing lately? The 9/11 Commission, you may remember, was created by Congress after the terrible attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in September 2001. The 2 co-chairs were Tom Kean, former governor from New Jersey, and Lee Hamilton, former congressman. They gave a report card back at the end of December. They say we're getting a C. I would say they were generous, okay? Generous. With respect to the nonproliferation, they say a C+. Interdiction, B, I would say that's generous. Integration of programs, D, I would say that's about right. And long-term sustainability of the program, D, I would say that's about right. They also say, looking to the Obama administration, and this is a little longer, but the message in these, if you look at them quickly, is that this has got to be the highest priority for the new administration. That impact of one nuclear bomb going off in one place will change our world. More nuclear weapon states will affect the stability of order globally and make likely nuclear wars. So under each one of these headings, I've got a list of 3 things to do, and then under each of those, another 3. Now we're getting a little bit into the weeds, but let me take just one more minute here. No loose nukes would have a gold standard applied everywhere. No new nascent nukes would orchestrate a strategy, which is what the Obama administration is trying to do, to get Iran to stop now, and to do so in a way transparent enough to give one confidence that Iran is not getting a nuclear bomb. And no new nuclear weapon states would engage China in basically rolling back the North Korean program. President Obama gave an extremely important speech in Prague in April, in which he laid out the most ambitious nuclear security agenda since any president since President Kennedy, who in the 1963 was fearful, as he said, of a world in which there would soon be 25 nuclear weapon states and nuclear wars and nuclear terrorism. In this speech, he calls for securing all weapons and materials to a gold standard in 4 years. Ambitious, easy to say, extremely hard to do. To reduce the role of nuclear weapons in the national security strategy of the U.S. Again, watch this space. The Nuclear Posture Review will come out from the Pentagon in December, and it'll be interesting to see how closely it matches President Obama's stated purpose, and a stronger International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the policeman for this. So to conclude, nuclear terrorism, I would say a very real and present danger. On the current trajectory here, 5 years into my bet, I still believe that in the next 5 years, it is more likely than not, that's not certain, but 51%, that horrible as it is, terrorists will succeed somewhere in exploding a nuclear bomb devastating some city, and that will change our world. But the second and most important proposition is that if this happens, God forbid, it will be for want of things that we could have done that somehow we didn't get our act together enough to do. So the commission, after a nuclear terrorist attack, will find that this was a preventable catastrophe. And what I would hope we would do, and this is now especially to students, this is an arena that will be important for your security and well-being and for our country for the rest of your life. It's a good question to think about and to work on. This is a topic which an ordinary citizen who's be serious can get their head around. So when you're reading in the paper or hearing the news about Iran or North Korea or Pakistan, you can understand what's going on. And the purpose for understanding, I would hope, is to help mobilize citizens to urge their political leadership, whether you're congressman or your senator or your governor or your mayor or people whom you know who work in the administration, to give this the priority it deserves. If it is the single most serious threat to U.S. security and well-being, it ought to be treated as such. And I would say, while President Obama has said the words, we're now getting to the second chapter, which is the work. And the work will be a lot harder than the words. So that's once over lightly on the general argument. I'm happy to take questions and particularly points of disagreement. And I gather there's microphones here on either side. Do you want to come down to the microphone? Probably that's best so people can hear you, sir. Yeah.
Hello.
Please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Thank you very much. This is very fine information. I believe that we all need to understand this clearly. Some of the important aspects here is that we live in an open world. Nuclear terror is really responsible. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Frederick Rash from California, and I'm very glad to be here. First of all, nuclear terror is prime. If you're going to stop nuclear terror, there are other options that are obvious that we must approach. Number one, decentralize. Number two, prepare with water, food, and medicine. Number three is, which I think is more important than nuclear terrorism, is the ability to take over the schools, the government, and the United States by government, taking away our freedoms, taxes, and so forth, and control the government by the inability for the persons here to be able to delegate themselves. This happened in Germany, Russia, Japan, China, Korea. He said, or if I make an objection, or if I feel that there's something else that's important, that was clear.
As long as you please be brief, because many other people would like to ask questions.
Okay, I'm going to conclude with that until we see the whole picture, we're only picking on nuclear terrorism. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm not sure I understood all of the import of the question, but I hear the general point, and I think your point is at least if I hear it, I'll say 2 points with which I agree. I'd say first that because we are an extremely open society, and it's the freedoms that we appreciate as Americans, and because now we live in a globalized situation, a globalized environment in which space and information and time have all shrunk, things that can happen way away, that used to be far away, actually can have impacts on us here immediately now. So the idea that some folks who are living almost in a medieval style in villages in Kandahar, Afghanistan, could hatch an attack that killed more Americans on 9/11, twice as many as the Japanese killed at Pearl Harbor. So killed more Americans, a non-state little group as compared, says we're in an entirely different world. So that part I agree. Secondly, I think while some people would hope, or there'll be impulses in trying to deal with something as terrifying as nuclear terrorism, to say we need to give up our liberties or we need to give up our form of government. I don't agree with that at all. I think the agenda of things that we need to do, as I said, are feasible and affordable. I just think we need to do them. But this is a longer discussion, and I appreciate your point. Yes, ma'am.
How would the United States retaliate to a nuclear attack?
Well, that's a good question. That could take a long answer, but let me give you a few just bullet points. I worked in the Reagan administration as the special advisor to Secretary Weinberger. We reviewed the war plans regularly because he and I were friends, and he had a place in Maine, and sometimes I would go up there and we would discuss things. The theory of the case, and this was called mutual assured destruction, is if the Soviet Union attacked the US with a nuclear weapon, we would retaliate in what would most likely become a nuclear Armageddon that might kill everybody in the US and everybody in the Soviet Union. And even there were scenarios in which You wouldn't know what the final consequences of this would be, but it might even be a nuclear winter and might even kill or threaten the human species on Earth. And you look at that and you say, nobody could seriously contemplate that. I mean, for what moral purpose is that proportionate or even, and we had many philosophical discussions about that topic, but it was the policy of the US under Republican and Democratic presidents regularly that was our policy and that was our plan, and that's what we built our forces for, and that was actually the planning undertaking. Now, the wonderful news for you is that terrible Cold War in which people worried about nuclear Armageddon is over, and the likelihood of a global nuclear war in which everybody would be killed, or hundreds of millions of people would be killed, has mercifully shrunk. So now President Obama does not get up and think, gee, is President Medvedev thinking of attacking me today? Or President Hu in China doesn't think, are the Americans about to attack me today? So that has gone down. What ironically has gone up is the likelihood of a single nuclear bomb finding its way out of the Russian arsenal or the Pakistani arsenal or the North Korean arsenal into the hands of somebody like the guys that brought us 9/11 and destroying a single city. So let's imagine, go to the second question on the list, if Kim Jong-il sold a bomb to Osama bin Laden, and that bomb came to Charlotte and was exploded, and President Obama was clear about whose fingerprints were on this bomb, that is North Korea's, even though it came to us via Osama bin Laden. There'll be a very serious discussion in the White House, but it's quite plausible that the response to it will be an attack on North Korea that will eliminate the possibility that North Korea could be the source of any further bomb. So I mean, we really are into the realm of Dr. Strangelove, but I would say that's our policy today, and I unfortunately don't know of a better policy. So this is a good question for somebody to work on. Please.
Thank you.
Do you support or reject the idea of mutually assured destruction?
Excuse me. Very good question. Let me try to be brief, but again, it's a complicated one. Mutual assured destruction was, in the first instance, a condition rather than a policy. So for a substantial period of time, the American position was, we should like to have nuclear superiority. It was only in time that the Soviet Union acquired an arsenal large enough that if there should be an attack upon the Soviet Union, they would have enough capability to retaliate such that at the end of the day, we would be destroyed. And one came to have, in effect, a mutual suicide pact. So mutual assured destruction is like a mutual suicide pact in which you and I feel comfortable that neither of us is going to shoot the other because that would be the equivalent of shooting himself. Now that has one good advantage, one serious advantage, which is no rational person would commit suicide for his country. It has a disadvantage in that could there be an accident or an unauthorized use of weapons or a miscalculation or a misperception that would trigger this. So I don't take comfort in a world of mutual assured destruction. I think it actually did serve a purpose during the Cold War, but the reason why there's a new enthusiasm about trying to find some way beyond mutual assured destruction, even to a world without nuclear weapons, hard as that is to visualize, but something that's now been visualized by 4 of the wisest American statesmen in this argument that Secretary Schultz and Kissinger and Perry and Nunn have been putting forward, is that one shouldn't take comfort from mutual assured destruction, but one should understand what the benefits, it had. Yes, sir?
Well, I'm currently speaking on behalf of the Wake Forest debate team. I'd like to thank you for this opportunity. Our current topic right now is nuclear weapons policy and the reduction and restriction of the role and missions of nuclear weapons. And you brought that up in your speech. I have two questions. My first one is, what do you think Obama's or the administration's NPR in December will look like, and what Obama will actually be able to implement and push for? And my second question was regarding tactical nuclear weapons, because I understand you played a large role in removing some of them from Europe recently, and what your thoughts on would be to a complete removal of tactical nuclear weapons from Europe in a world like today, where what implications would that have? Would that help things like loose nukes? Because a lot of experts say that it would.
Okay, well, very interesting that this is a topic for the debate team. I didn't know that, but good for you. So you're pretty deep into the topic, but for people that don't, just context, the nuclear posture review is something that occurs every 4 years, usually in the first year of a president's administration, and it involves a Defense Department-led review of what do we have nuclear weapons for, so what's the purpose, what are the targets for which we would use nuclear weapons, how many weapons do we need, what kind of nuclear weapons do we need, and so forth. So and this posture review is meant to be delivered to the President in the beginning of December, and then the Congress by the end of December or early January, and to inform the budget that goes to Congress in 2011. President Obama has signaled pretty clearly his idea about where this should be going. But having watched many nuclear posture reviews at the Defense Department, there's a set of ingrained interests, and so there'll undoubtedly be a struggle. That'd be my bet. From the Defense Department point of view, most people are not very interested in nuclear weapons, most of the services, but the labs are very interested in nuclear weapons. And some of the people who work in that domain are interested. And in any case, they are concerned that as long as we have nuclear weapons, they're sure that they have an adequate number of nuclear weapons, an adequate number of different types of nuclear weapons, and most importantly, that the weapons are what they call, quote, reliable. That is, they work if you use them. Now, since we don't have nuclear tests anymore, they have to then do calculations and simulations which give them confidence that the nuclear weapons that are in the arsenal are reliable. And the people at the 3 nuclear weapons labs have to sign a paper every year saying, I'm certifying on the basis of my best judgment that the weapons in the arsenal are reliable. So that then led to this debate about a reliable replacement warhead, one new warhead, and so forth. I would say my best bet of where it's going to come out is they will say that there are fewer missions for nuclear weapons today, and maybe even say that the only mission for nuclear weapons is to deter the use of nuclear weapons against us. That'll be a debate, but I think they may come out there. And secondly, that with respect to the reliability, they'll kick the can down the road by saying each of the types of nuclear weapons should be reviewed, and it should be determined in a case-by-case basis in terms of both the fissile material pit and the rest of the moving parts, whether they're adequate for the next decade ahead. So this is basically the line that was taken in the Perry Schlesinger report. So that's where I would bet it would come out. On TAC nukes, more briefly, I think the main thing to worry about TAC nukes is Russian TAC nukes, not our TAC nukes. Our TAC nukes have largely been cleaned out of the forces, except for a small number in Europe, as you mentioned. And I think the question about the forces, our tactical nuclear weapons should be, what leverage can we get from those for trying to make sure that the tactical nuclear weapons of Russia are both fewer, more concentrated, and more confidently controlled. Sorry, it's a long topic, and I went on longer with the answer than I meant to. Please.
Hi. I was wondering, you talk about the challenges of getting rid or destroying nuclear weapons being North Korea and Iran, and people that we're afraid of. Should we have the right to tell them what to do with their nukes if we're not willing to cap our nuclear protection ourselves, or are we? Would you demand that your doctrine of no's be worldwide, or would it only be to countries that we're afraid of?
Extremely good question, even a profound question, because Americans, of which I'm quintessentially American, see the things through fairly narrowly American chauvinistic eyes. And many people in other countries ask the question, well, why are things that are good for you not good for me? So Mr. Ahmadinejad likes to ask, you explain that nuclear weapons are extremely important for America, but they're not important for Iran. Or the fellow who runs the IAEA likes to say that we're like people that go to the high school and give a lecture about not smoking while having a camel, in our mouth or something, or from our lip. So what about the fourth no? No nuclear weapons for anybody. And this has actually been put on the table for debate, as I said, by these four horsemen or four statesmen. You can see their op-ed in the Wall Street Journal last January, which is a very compelling presentation of the case by four extremely wise Americans. I have come reluctantly to be a supporter of their point of view over the long run. That is, our aspiration, per their argument, should be to achieve a world without nuclear weapons. Though I must say, having worked on this problem and actually written a book on it back in the 80s, I can't quite see how this ultimately happens. I mean, just the practicality of it. But Sam Nunn has a metaphor which makes me more persuaded. He says, this is like a mountaintop, a world in which there were no nuclear weapons, in which all the arsenals had been eliminated. It's like the top of a mountain, and not until you get to the next base camp will you be above the clouds where you can see the practicalities of the next stages. So what they have is basically a vision of a world free of nuclear weapons, which is a little fuzzy in my mind about the last stage. But then they have a very ambitious agenda of actions that we need to be taking now to get to the next base camp. So to be specific, if North Korea and Iran become nuclear weapon states now, and then you get this cascade of proliferation, any vision of a world free of nuclear weapons just goes away. So the urgency for me is working on the nearer term agenda. And for the American arsenal, I would say we should be pushing nuclear weapons out of the arsenal and into the background as rapidly as possible. So de-emphasizing the role of nuclear weapons in our arsenal, as President Obama has suggested, seems to me exactly right. And actually, in terms of the military missions that we have, we don't have a compelling need for nuclear weapons. The problem is then with states that are weaker now currently, like Russia, where that argument is less compelling. So good question, thank you.
Thank you.
Please.
After the fall of the Soviet Union, there were a lot of loose nukes in Russia, and yet the attacks on the World Trade Center twice were both conventional attacks. Right. I remember reading a piece in the National Interest where Mueller argued that you prophesied that they would have an attack before the decade is out back in 1995. Why did the attacks not occur with nuclear weapons before, when there were more unsecured nukes and Al-Qaeda was at the peak of its power? And why will there be an attack more likely in the future than in the past?
Extremely good question. I was much involved in this story in many iterations. I'd say the the main reason why things haven't been haven't been as bad as they should. How can it be the case that here we are 19 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union and no nuclear weapons from the former Soviet arsenal have turned up in the international markets? I mean, it's inconceivable, almost inconceivable. In the nuclear terrorism book, actually, on the question of where, I have a great quote from Dick Cheney, who was at the time, this is in 1991, the Secretary of Defense. He's on Face the Nation, this is December 1991, just a couple of weeks before the Soviet Union disappears. And he says, if the Soviets do an excellent job of retaining control over their stockpile of nuclear weapons, let's say they have 25,000, and they are 99% successful, this would mean you would still have as many as 250 of the weapons that they would not be able to control. And then he went on to say FedEx wouldn't do much better than that. So what happened? I would say, first, grace and good fortune. And if tomorrow a nuclear weapon showed up, I wouldn't be surprised. Secondly, the custodians of the nuclear weapons in the Soviet Union turned out to be a whole lot more professional and serious about their job than anybody anticipated. The 12th Gumo, who are the guys that control the weapons for the Russian military, if they had been investment bankers, what would they have done? They would have monetized their assets. What were their assets? Nuclear weapons. Could they have sold them? Of course they could. Why didn't they do this? Okay, I would say maybe in part they didn't have so much imagination. In part they had a professional responsibility, but in any case, thank goodness they didn't. And then thirdly, the Americans did some things right. I'd say probably the most exciting activity that I was involved in was the beginning of the Clinton administration, where I was Assistant Secretary of Defense. And my job was the nuclear weapons that were left outside of Russia when Russia disappeared. So President Clinton said to me, there's 18,000 weapons. Somebody's supposed to look after these all the time. You go look at this. Okay, so I began to look at these. There was 4,620 strategic nuclear warheads that were on top of missiles in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. And there was about 14,000 tactical nuclear weapons that were all spread across 14 newly independent states, most of which had never been countries before. Now, how did all those weapons get rounded up? I mean, by the end of the story, to the best of our ability, well, we certainly haven't found any missing. So we don't know what we don't know, but to the best of our ability, all 18,000 got rounded up and taken back to Russia. Most of them actually have been being dismantled. And I would say there was a huge effort undertaken by the US. The Nunn-Lugar legislation, which was an initiative by, bipartisan initiative by a great Democratic Senator Nunn and a great Republican Senator Lugar, provided funding for it. There was some good work done in the American side. There was a lot of extremely good work done on the Russian side. So by the end of the story, it turned out. But I would say it could easily have turned out otherwise. Indeed, if you had been making a bet with Dick Cheney at the time, he would have said for sure 250 would go missing. And if you'd asked me, I would have said for sure a number of them were going missing. But I think it actually illustrates the main point, to go back to the nuclear terrorism argument. This is not, we're in the hands of forces that we can't control. This is an argument that says there's a trend line that actually could be bent. Bending it will require a lot of hard work, but actually it's been bent before in other cases, and so that ought to be the motivation. Good question, thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks for coming first of all, and I have a couple questions. I agree with most of what you say, and but it seems to be mostly regarding the prevention of acquisition of nuclear weapons by groups or nations that pose a military threat to the United States. I don't really understand why in your analysis of the subject that possession equals immediate use of said nuclear weapons. For example, 9/11 was planned, although planes could be hijacked at any given time. Logically, nuclear weapons would involve planning as well due to the difficulty involved in acquiring these bombs. So I was wondering, one, why do we assume the immediate use of said weapons? Two, is there a possibility of weapons in the possession of groups that pose a military threat? And three, if they do possess these nuclear warheads, how would we go about stopping?
Okay, another interesting question and complex, but let me try to give a short answer. I agree with you, and I think it's a very salutary reminder for all of us. Al-Qaeda is an extremely methodical operation. Now, fortunately, the strategy that's now being followed has been eliminating their leadership more successfully than we had ever been doing before. So particularly these predator strikes have been killing a lot of the Al-Qaeda leadership in ungoverned Pakistan, though unfortunately the two worst guys at the top of the pyramid, Osama bin Laden and Zawahiri, his operational number 2, are still out there missing. They planned 9/11 for 5 years, just what you said. And if you want to learn about that, look at the 9/11 Commission report. It's really quite chilling. And the information that comes out of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the mastermind, a fellow who's in Guantanamo right now. He explains how he first went to Osama bin Laden with the plan to hijack one airplane and crash it into CIA headquarters. And bin Laden said, "Why do you use an axe when you could use a bulldozer?" So he thinks about that, and he goes off, he plans for another 6 months, comes back to him. He's got a plan for, what did he have? 12 airplanes, 4 on the East Coast, 4 in the Midwest, 4 on the West Coast, all coordinated at the same time. Osama bin Laden said, "That's too complicated, you know, too much chance of, so go plan some more." He came back and planned again with 9/11. Now you look at 9/11, if you were doing an exercise with any intelligence community, any intelligence service in the world, and said, how would you grade 9/11 as an intelligence action? They would give it an A. That is to find 4 airplanes, to bring pilots here, to put them in place, to have them trained to learn to fly but not to land, to get 4 airplanes that took off at about the same time, to think about the passengers, to think about your targets. It was extremely well done. So they planned. So they could be planning a nuclear terror. Do they have a nuclear cell that's been working? Yes, of course they do. Have they bought 3 times purchases that turned out to be wrong? Yes, they have. After getting cheated the second time, I tell in the nuclear terrorism book, Osama bin Laden said, "Gee, this is not working. The Pakistanis know how to make nuclear bombs. Get some Pakistani nuclear scientists, get them to come to them, they can help us." So 2 of the key guys that worked for A.Q. Khan came to see Osama and Zawahiri in Afghanistan. They were there for a couple of days. They explained to them what they need. So they can be working on this, and they are. I would say that the hardest, you know, the high hurdle in this exercise, they can think of all the other pieces, is getting the bomb. And they've been working on the pieces of it, or getting enough material to make an improvised bomb. But I would suspect that after they got it, fearful that they would be killed or found out or caught, and because they've challenged the whole community of Al-Qaeda to trump 9/11, and actually there's now a lot of whining in the in the Al-Qaeda blog circles about, well, we haven't been doing anything, you know, anything serious lately. So the challenge is out there. So I would just think it would be because of the fear of being found out that they would be trying to execute as quickly as they could. Secondly, do we know of anybody that's acquired a bomb or the material for a bomb? We know that people have tried to buy it. We don't know of anybody who has a bomb. And if they had a bomb and we didn't know about it, well, of course we wouldn't know. So good question. Thank you.
Thank you. How supportive would you be of an American or Israeli attack on Iranian nuclear facilities or on Iran in general?
We were debating this today, and my view is as follows. First, not. And the main argument that I make, both to Israelis and to the American government, is for sure, you cannot destroy any targets you cannot identify. So Israel can attack any known facility in Iran and do a pretty good job of destroying it. We can attack those targets as well and do 2 or 3 times the job. So some people arguing, well, as long as it's being done, we should do it rather than the Israelis. But I'm thinking, wait a minute. It's not the size of the destruction that I can cause at a particular facility that's the relevant factor. It's the fact that we know with high confidence that they're targets that we haven't identified. One of which would have been, for example, this Qom facility that's just been in the paper the last week. So you put yourself in the position of the manager of the Iranian nuclear program. As one of my intelligence community friends says, if you were the manager of the program and you put all your nuclear eggs in the one basket that's under the spotlight of international inspectors at Natanz, which people are threatening to bomb from time to time, you should be fired. I mean, is it conceivable that you would do that? The answer is not rationally. So I would say I have high confidence in the likelihood that the Iranians have a dispersed array of facilities. And therefore, if I attack the facilities that I know about, but am unable to destroy the facilities I don't know about, this gets to the last question on the, on the quiz. I may actually accelerate the date on which Iran gets the first bomb. Now go back one step beyond that. I would urge you, if you're interested in Iran, read the unclassified portion of the National Intelligence Estimate that came out in December of 2007. So this is the unanimous view of the 16 or 18 American intelligence agencies in their report to the president, telling it as straight as they can. It's oddly presented because it was meant to be classified and it became to be public. But in it, they say, their view, which also has been repeated by Denny Blair, who's the current director of national intelligence, that they don't believe that Iran has made a final decision about whether it's going to build a nuclear bomb. So they think Iran has decided to build the infrastructure for a nuclear weapons program. They'll give them an option to go very quickly to a nuclear bomb, but they may not have decided to go this last mile. Well, in that case, I may be able to persuade them to stop there, or maybe even a little bit short of there. And if I compare that with what I think would be the consequences of a military attack, whether Israeli or American, on Iran, which won't be the last move in that game. It'll open a Pandora's box. It'll go, many rounds after that. I'm not enthusiastic about the military option. Oh, sorry, one more question, this gentleman.
All right, I'd like to thank you for coming out here and talking to us tonight. Now, my question for you is, where exactly do we draw the line with nuclear intervention? Because I can foresee that seizing loose nukes and stopping nuclear enrichment programs abroad can be as potentially dangerous as not acting at all, because doing so could be viewed as an act of aggression and cause a nuclear attack.
Well, that's a good question. And I think as you suggest, it's got to be more country specific. If the president tonight got information that Al-Qaeda had gotten a nuclear bomb or several nuclear bombs from some source, Pakistan or Russia, and had these weapons in ungoverned Pakistan, and was in the process of transporting the weapons to the U.S., he would certainly order an all-scale effort to interdict the shipment of those bombs, including taking extremely risky actions. So, just to put it in perspective, right now, tonight, or every day, Predator missiles, which are missiles, on a drone that's flying around in a place like ungoverned Pakistan, will identify a caravan of people, and if they have high confidence that it includes Al-Qaeda leadership targets, even though there may be a half dozen other people there with them, zap them, and collateral damage is the other people who die. And that has terrible consequences, as General McChrystal says, for the rest of the population, because sometimes they get the wrong guys altogether. And in any case, sometimes they kill innocent people. So that, unfortunately, is the horrible fact of of war. So I think if a terrorist group had nuclear weapons and was trying to transport them, that one is the pretty straightforward case, in my view. On the other hand, let's imagine that some nuclear weapons were loose in Russia. And now you don't quite know what's going on. Well, Russia has a huge arsenal of nuclear weapons that worry us, here at home. So the idea that the U.S. would be intervening in Russia seems pretty slim, which is why I go back to the earlier argument. I think we need to have this coalition of the nuclear weapon states who share a common interest in not losing nuclear weapons and in terrorists not getting nuclear weapons. But the idea that we would be policing events inside Russia or inside China, I don't think so. Now, Pakistan becomes the toughest of the cases. Pakistan has tripled its arsenal of nuclear weapons and materials in the last 8 years, as it's become an increasingly unstable state. So, if Pakistan seemed to be unraveling in some way, could you imagine Americans intervening in Pakistan? There are a lot of people that live in Pakistan. They would not like to have us there. This would be an extremely difficult operation. But the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said if he were asked if there were another terrorist attack upon the U.S., where would it have been plotted and planned? It would be in ungoverned Pakistan. And he said, and it was his judgment that the American people would demand that the Americans intervene in Pakistan, with consequences that might be terribly destabilizing for the whole government of Pakistan. So I would say, if you want a nightmare case to work on, that's the one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Allison, we thank you for your very lucid, sometimes troubling, but certainly realistic depiction of one of the problems of our time. Join me again in thanking Dr. Allison for being with us. Thank you and good evening.